morning. I think we're about ready to start. Raise your hands if you can hear me. Hey, excellent news. Okay, I'm very intimidated by this whole headset setup. Good morning. So my name is Sophia Omar, and I am a program manager at an organisation called the Impact Investing Institute. It's a huge pleasure to be here this morning. Can't hear me? Better? Oof. Okay. Fancy headsets, not my scene. I was just saying, it is a real pleasure to be here this morning. And my name is Sophia Omar. I'm a program manager at the Impact Investing Institute. And we are an independent non-profit that was set up to help connect capital to impact and help investors put impact at the heart of their commercial investing strategies. My role really focuses on supporting asset owners to consider supporting asset owners, including pension schemes, to invest in a way that supports a thriving economy, prosperous communities, and a sustainable, livable planet. All of these things are vital and of great importance to pension scheme members and the world in which they retire. And so this morning, we are here to talk about pensions, and specifically, pensions and the climate transition. So, pension schemes are long-term investors with a huge responsibility. They look after the future retirement of their members. And in the UK alone, pension schemes represent over £2 trillion of assets. Those assets are both exposed to climate risk and have a role in shaping our planetary future. And we know climate change poses material risks. It poses risks to businesses, to investors, to economies, both through physical impacts, like extreme weather events, and through transition risks as we shift to a low-carbon economy. Great progress has been made in understanding and managing those risks. But it is notable that the Pensions Regulator, from whom we have an esteemed representative today, recently stated that only 60% of pension schemes in the UK have a net zero target. So, understanding climate risk is complicated. I know that. These are unprecedented, interconnected issues. And addressing them is even more complicated. But we have to think through questions like, do schemes have the right data to make decisions? How do we prevent disclosures from becoming mere box-ticking exercises? And crucially, how do we move from just disclosing and managing risks to actively contributing to solutions and delivering a future that members can sustainably retire into? Big questions, but we have a wonderful panel here today to discuss them all. So, we've got about 35 minutes of content, and we're going to go through where are we now, what does the state of the sector look like, and what are pension schemes doing? What are some of the key obstacles and challenges that people are facing? And crucially, what does the future look like? Where do we want to go? How do we get there? And how are people across the sector changing their practices to get us to that point? We'll then have 15 minutes of audience Q&A, so please prepare questions. This is a really wonderful and expert panel. Grill them. And then we'll have a wrap up and close. And I believe we're running about exactly 10 minutes over time, so we're going to try and keep it very, very tight and finish no later than 1:05. So I'm going to stop talking because you all came here to listen to these wonderful people. I'm going to ask everybody to give a brief, super quick 1-minute introduction, who they are and the perspective that they bring to this conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to pass to you.
Hello, so I'm Mark Hill. I head ESG, Climate and Sustainability at Pensions Regulator, and I'll give that regulatory perspective about how we're working with trustees on this challenge.
Brilliant. Over to you.
Gosh, that was quick. I'm Mike Clark, I'm founder director, and the first I've got to say is if you haven't seen the BYD Red London bus, go see the BYD bus. I'm an actuary. I spend a lot of time on systemic risk and finance, and the fact that risk comes in two types, societal risk and financial risk, and has lots of implications. And since Mark was quick, I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Over to you, Heather.
So, Hetal Patel, great to be here. Good afternoon, everybody. I actually wear two hats. So, with my first hat, I head up sustainable investment research at Phoenix Group. We're the UK's largest long-term savings and retirements firm. and over there I help green the portfolio. And with my other hat, I represent PCAV. I chair PCAV's core team. So PCAV is the standard setter for carbon accounting for the financial sector, and the core team is responsible for governance and development of the PCAV standard, which is you could call it the Bible for carbon accounting.
Afternoon all, I'm Aston Chan. I'm the Chief Investment Officer of Impact Cubed. We advise asset owners, including pension plans, on how to integrate sustainability into their investment process.
And hi, I'm Leah Worrell. I'm the Deputy Head of Sustainable Investment Insight at ISIO, so I lead on sustainability research with a focus on sort of research papers and technology solutions. As a house, we provide investment advice and sustainability advice and actuarial advice and other advice to a variety of investors, including pension schemes and family offices and endowments. I think today my comments will be more from the asset owner perspective, given that's who we advise, but also I'll have my research hat on to get a bit technical as needed.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Mark, if I can start with you, as our regulator and with your sort of bird's eye view of the landscape, what's your perspective on where pension schemes currently stand in addressing climate risks, and why are they such an important piece of the puzzle?
So where do they stand? The feedback we've had is the first 2 years of climate-related financial disclosures, TCFD, has a big impact. It's on the trustee board agendas. It's now part of their risk management and opportunity management systems. It's very much integrated into decisions. But that hides the fact now we're entering a stage where possibly in danger of becoming a compliance and tick box exercise. So the return on that investment is a discussion that we're already having. In terms of the bigger picture though, only 17% of DC schemes actually said they've devoted resources to looking at the impact of climate change. And equally, only 28% of DC schemes feel they understand the climate risks well, which compares to 65% of DB schemes, which say they have a good understanding, and 54% of those schemes are actually devoting time and resources. So a bit of a mixed picture.
Very mixed picture. I might ask a follow-up question on that. Do you have any kind of thoughts on why there's that gap between DC and DB?
No, I'm not so sure, to be honest, because, no. And it's something I am looking into.
I'm fascinated. Well, hopefully we'll be back here next year and we'll have the answer to that. Hetal, from your perspective, you have, we mentioned your multiple hats. We've heard those, honestly, quite shocking statistics. 17% is 25% devoting resources or understanding is not great, given the scale of the challenges. Do you feel that schemes are genuinely embracing this approach and really integrating considerations of climate risk into their actions?
Interesting, I'm slightly surprised by that number because I have the good fortune for where I sit at Phoenix Group. We serve a number of pension scheme clients. We have a master trust, we have an independent governance committee, and then we have quite a lot of own trust clients as well. And from what I've seen, I've been looking afar. So insurance companies have got on board the climate journey. We had the supervisory statement SS319 back in 2019. So insurers, banks started the climate journey a little bit earlier. Then the DWP regulations came out 2021. And I've seen that entire community, the pension fund community, trustees, consultants, the entire community, they've embraced the whole climate challenge, getting up to speed with reporting, think about different metrics, think about the targets they want to set. Possibly, I might be a little bit biased that I'm seeing some of the larger schemes, the slightly better resource, better advice schemes, and so that might skew what I'm seeing. But from what I've seen, I think they've risen to the challenge. So I'm slightly surprised by that low number.
I'll
not disputing it.
No, I'll clarify it. So the larger schemes, which are 1,000 members plus, and the master trusts, you're 92% to 100% devoted to,
Yeah, it's a story of two people, looking at the elephant. Somebody's holding a leg, somebody's holding a trunk. You see different things.
Inevitably, but given how fragmented and how many schemes there are across the UK, this is a question I can bring to you. You've said famously in our briefing call that pension schemes are not, I thought it was very famous, trustees are not thinking straight about climate change. And clearly that's not true in every part of the sector, as we've heard from Hetal, but it is true for some schemes, and there seems to be a tilt towards the raw resources schemes have available. So what does that look like? What's the biggest misconception you see trustees making who haven't got this front and centre of the agenda?
Well, to be fair to trustees, I think it's the system supporting those misconceptions. And just to have a crack at Mark's question, I think one of the reasons to the question you asked about DC versus DB is that DC fiduciaries realise that those members bear the investment risk, whereas actually in a DB scheme, the trustees sort of think, well, we've always got the plan sponsor or got the PPF, so they sort of get to it less. So I think because in a way we are trying to invest for beneficiaries' retirements, for the DC schemes I know, it's pretty clear that if you've got a 20-year-old, they could be in that scheme in 60 years. So although you're not making a 6-year decision, you're making decisions knowing that this person could be in the scheme. To your question, I spend a lot of my time trying to and present uncomfortable truths. So I think somebody mentioned data, it might have been you. There's far too much attention to data for asset owners. Asset owners should be being strategic. Data's increasingly something for investment managers and their portfolios. I think you referred to net zero. Actually, net zero is not a goal for the pension sector. Net zero, he said, is a goal for public policy, and the pension sector should be trying to finance economic activity that leads to net zero. So as somebody who built GFANS before Carney named it, we sort of realised that net zero is public policy, and over here we just do financial risk and return. So that's part of the rethinking. And also, I probably take a slightly different view on responsibility. As a trustee, as a fiduciary, my job is to pay pensions. To do that, I need to manage the portfolio well. I'm not that interested how many women there are on the board unless it's going to help investment decisions. So I think the investment sector is waking up to the fact that we do financial risk and return, and the Chancellor may authorise Rosebank, but that's GDP and her growth. We do financial risk and return and may not want a stranded asset. So I think as that conversation permeates, we are beginning to separate who's responsible for what. Economics is not finance, there's an overlap. So I think there's lots of sort of unpicking of thinking.
No, that's a fair, though arguably controversial point, and I really encourage if anybody on the panel wants to come back to that in response, please do. I would question, I think you're right, net zero is a public policy question, but as we've seen, there's still climate targets and climate risks are relevant to schemes, and that's maybe not integrated as well as it could be into decision making. And I guess that's how much the semantics of that is helpful in getting us to where we want to go.
I debate the climate targets. The climate target for me is financial risk, having regard to climate risk. So trying to head for a temperature is silly. That's probably good for nature, but nobody else. So I think we have allowed ourselves to be fooled by a lot of common ideas, and beginning to unpick what individual bits of the system are effectively responsible for is effectively the title of this session is envisioning the future. I'm offering some envisioning.
That's brilliant, and maybe I can ask a kind of practical follow-up question of how do we start to unpick that? I'm jumping ahead. This
wasn't a setup. 2 months ago, I wrote a short piece called A Transition Mind Does Climate Due Diligence. We haven't talked about the accounting problem. There's a lot of places where investors are being fooled by finance and or economics. Mainstream economics is terrible at financial risk. Climate doesn't do equilibrium. So there's a whole load of thinking which I've tried to get my head around, and then I wrote a small piece, but that wasn't a setup.
No, it wasn't. But it sounds like a fascinating piece, and I'd encourage people to read it. But if I can move on to, I guess, other misconceptions or issues of systemic... Sorry, this microphone is not my friend. Problems within the system that maybe prevent us from doing what needs to be done. Leo, we talked about mismatched time horizons and this kind of short-termism that's inherent in a lot of ways that the financial services and pension system is set up. And Mike mentioned the youngest member of his DC scheme might be 20. That's a very long investment horizon. So I was wondering if you could give a little bit more colour on that.
Yeah, of course. So I guess just in a nutshell, what do we mean by time horizon mismatch? So of course we've got some short-termism in financial markets, as we might refer to it from the sustainability perspective, which is you're looking at quarterly returns over the next quarter, you're looking at annual investment returns, you're looking at time horizons over the next 3 to 5 years. And as we start to feel systemic risks, yes, they're playing through today, but we are actually playing out over decades-long time horizons. So that's where the youngest member that retires in, say, 2065 to 2075, they have a big issue in that if they're sort of responding to, their assets were being managed by asset managers, which are focused on sort of short-term profits for their shareholders, there's a fundamental mismatch in the system. And I might add one more, which was from a session yesterday. I did another session, and it was the local authority pensions fund forum, and they had a really good analogy, which I'd like to steal today, which is sort of climate change and seeing that as a systemic risk. And what we mean by systemic risk ultimately is no one can escape from it. And it's this analogy of a car hurtling towards a cliff, and we all know the cliff's there, we all know we're hurtling towards it, and we all know that we're not slowing down quickly enough. And we're all trying to do our part, but actually there's a big implementation shortfall, and we're all looking to each other. Businesses are looking to government, government's looking to investors, and so on and so forth. And no one's actually getting into the driver's seat to stop us. But we're all trying to do our part. We're all trying to get somewhere. So it's a bit interesting. But I think the second part of your question was a bit more around systems and governments, if I may do another really quick 30 seconds. It's sort of thinking about systems change. So that analogy of being in a car is we need to change the whole system. So I think Mike mentioned the accounting part. So we can extract from nature and we can pollute back into nature, and there's zero cost for that, and those are externalities. So how do we embed that into the way that we measure growth or the way that we measure investment success? And we need coalitions of the willing. So for example, Pensions for Purpose have set up a systems and governance group to look at how we can change the very systems that we work in to create the right incentives. I think there's a lot of willing, there's a lot of climate sort of action, but I think we've got to stop and reassess, particularly this week, and just realise it's not quite enough yet. So we need to galvanise further action.
We do. I think that's very clear, and I really like the car analogy. It's one of those nice visual metaphors that sticks. And we've talked a little bit from both of you, and with slightly different perspectives on allocating and understanding roles and responsibilities. I think there's a really tricky element, exactly as you say, sometimes everybody's looking to everybody else, but also understanding what's within people's remit and not expecting too much from the other side, and how do we find that balance of coordination, and what does a system look like? And actually, I think one of the big problems that I've often seen is there's a linguistic or definitional piece that can really get in the way and be very sticky. Everybody's either talking about the same thing but using different language, or talking about the completely different things and using the same language, and that can be a very can get us stuck in the mud. And on that note, Aston, I wanted to come to you. We talked in the briefing call about ESG and the language and those real misconception of what that was and how it worked, and that either ESG was inevitably going to hurt returns, it wasn't just a risk management approach, it's become very politicized. How do you speak to schemes about this? How do you navigate some of those challenges of understanding what everybody's talking about?
Yeah, the statement that ESG or climate investing is bad for performance is by far the most common misconception out Now, it's not difficult to understand why that is the case. I think there are some high-profile cases of underperformance, and frankly, the market is still rather early stage in being able to integrate climate transition and sustainability in an efficient way from a risk-return perspective. Now, having said all that, the statement that ESG is bad performance cannot be true. Let's take a step back and see what is sustainability investing, what is climate investing. What you're trying to do is to select securities, companies, based on certain characteristics that are linked to the climate, and you make sure that your portfolio also have the right exposure on those metrics. That's all sustainability investing is. Now, that sounds an awful lot like factor investing, something that we've been doing for over 30, 40 years. It's as old as I am. Is it realistic to say that factor investing is bad for performance? Well, no, you can't say that. It depends. Which factor? Is it value? Is it momentum? Is it quality? Is it size? And it's no different in sustainability investing. Carbon, low carbon, has a very different characteristic to green revenue, environmental solutions company. So what we do as an owner is we show them that sustainability, climate is not one homogeneous tag. There are nuances to it. There's decarbonization, there's green revenue, there's transition risk. And we help them understand each one of them, what is their risk and return characteristics, and they can then formulate a policy in a more informed way, and certainly one that they can justify, they can stand behind, to give them a more long-term view, like Leah says, so it's not just short-term explaining performance on a quarter-to-quarter basis.
You make it sound so simple.
It's really simple. Come talk to me.
I wonder if anybody else on the panel has any reflections on that.
Well, it's more reflection. I think the car analogy is helpful, but it misses a point. A system has no driver. So do not assume anybody can leap into the car because there is nobody. Nature gives us the cliff. Governments set the terrain and the rules for building cars and things like that. So just understanding that a system works like a system is helpful. And at some point, you almost ask the question about understanding the system. I've got your 1 minute answer, but let's go elsewhere first.
Can I
Please.
just add a bit? I mean, you combine the 2 points made by Leah and Ashton. It all boils down to, what sort of time horizon are you looking at? Well, sustainability is, you're trying to preserve. And if we look long enough, I think any investment anything that's harmful to the planet in the long run will be harmful to your portfolio. And so if you look long enough, then things you'd say are sustainable today probably will do better in the long run. The question is, what is that time horizon? And the problem is that decision makers only think, well, what's my tenure? And this is the kind of dichotomy we face.
Yeah, if may I add, that will be different for a DC scheme or a very maturing DB scheme. Now, is 3 year a good time frame? Is 3 year medium term? Is 10 year long term? It's very hard to say. There are lots of quirks about sustainability investing. For example, we've mentioned kind of transition companies a few times already. Now, these companies don't perform well in all market conditions. They're younger companies. They might not even have positive cash flow. They may require government subsidies to work. They may not pay any dividends. And it wouldn't surprise you that they started underperforming as soon as interest rates stopped being zero in 2021, 2022. Now, how long can an investment committee, can a set of trustees sit on a portfolio of essentially venture-like companies when interest rates are 5%? Now, so that is a real conundrum, and it's not as simple as saying in the long term it will be fine. There are valid short-term considerations as well.
And I guess before I move on, and Mark, I want to ask you something a bit about the regulatory framework and whether it's sufficient to make these very complicated and complex decisions. But I guess if anybody has a last thought on how one balances those very valid short and long term, especially when it's much easier to look at the short term because
I think I might also come back on Mike's point, because I think I agree that a system doesn't necessarily have a driver, except that is the way that we currently think, in that we are all looking to the regulator, sorry Mark, to tell us what to do. So ultimately I think that sort of, I don't know, if we had to catalyse some significant or catalytic thinking around how to create some climate impact, I think that would have to think about bringing those long term into the short term. How do we incentivise in the short term for, you know, asset managers, for, you know, across the industry, for insurers, so that we can start to think about this mismatch. And I mean, I talk about this as if there are solutions out there at the moment. No, there aren't. But I think, you know, a conversation going down that road could be helpful.
I like a gentle challenge to that view.
1 minute of gentle challenge.
Does a corporate board look to the regulator to tell them how to run their business? No. Pension trustees have got a job to serve their members. The regulator may give them guidance, but if corporates, PLCs, ask the regulator what to do, it's probably communism. So I think it's dangerous to think the regulator needs to tell us what to do. Trustees are working out what to do within the regulatory guidelines, but ambition is not a result of regulation. Ambition is a result of ambition. So I just offer you that counter.
Thank you very much, Mike. I think we're probably going to stop that conversation there, because we could go on for most of the rest of the panel and probably most of the rest of the day, but maybe I can turn to our regulator. You know, we've talked a lot about what is the job, or what are the roles and responsibilities, and honestly the duties of trustees. Is our current regulatory environment, our fiduciary duties, sufficient or sufficiently clear enough to help trustees navigate these really difficult decisions?
Great question. I'll just start by saying the regulator isn't licensed to give investment advice, so I'll just highlight that. So yeah, it's an interesting one, because the bigger schemes that we were talking about, the more progressive schemes, have a really quite sophisticated understanding of fiduciary duty. NatWest Cushion with a recent opinion from Eversheds, but it is only an opinion. But it's an interesting one, as it talks about investing in the UK in a way that supports the standard of living of members of schemes. Other trustees in smaller schemes without the necessary in-house expertise and access to that kind of advice have probably got a more conservative understanding of their fiduciary duty, very much focused on that delivering a maximum return in keeping with the terms of the trust. That's why lawyers always like me to add at the end of that. And they're probably doing things in the same way they've always done things, with the same advice. Which does bring me back to something that the regulators recognised, is for trustees to do their job. It's that understanding, both of fiduciary duty, but equally climate, sustainability, nature loss, social factors. It's the advice they're getting from their advisors, how consistent and what's the quality of that. And then the tools, which takes us into problems with climate scenario analysis, etc.
I would totally echo that. Maybe we could dig a little bit into the problems with climate scenario analysis, and to that point of, are we set up enough to make good decisions?
Mike is going to come in here in a bit.
Yeah, but only very briefly.
I would say that the work that Mike and others have done on using a more qualitative narrative-based approach has been really good in getting around the challenges with the current models. And Mike can go into more detail around tipping points, etc. But yeah, that qualitative approach has been really, really, really useful.
Please.
Briefly, the Bank of England's CBES scenarios were not decision useful, and that's the polite term. Leading pension funds, thank you Mark for the setup, have realised that. A couple of years ago I was one of the authors of the No Time to Lose narrative climate scenarios for USS, which are inching through the pension system. More recently, in an unnamed group, because there was career risk, although I'm very happy to be known as one of the authors, we wrote some scenarios for the insurance sector. The USS scenarios were very analytical. The insurance ones have a view. There are 3 scenarios, and they place the insurance sector globally in the great abandonment scenario, and you might want to think about that.
Thank you. That was perfectly succinct, not too brief, not too. Maybe I can move on to you, Hathor, and talk a little bit of. So, we've talked about scenarios, adequacy, lack of adequacy. How do trustees, or how can trustees evaluate what's happening, and also how can they evaluate whether their current approach is looking at long-term building long-term portfolio resilience, or if it is just to previous points becoming a bit of a compliance exercise?
So a few different things to unpack there. So firstly, where are trustees right now? And agree, well, granted, from what we mentioned earlier, I'm seeing a slightly biased perspective that I'm seeing some of the larger schemes. And I know Mike's taken a slightly controversial position on, what should trustees care about.
Mainstream soon.
Mainstream in the US, absolutely. Here in Europe, we're still in the land of ESG. But
energy, security, and guns, right?
Where I'm seeing is there has been this big backlash in ESG. Nobody requires me to kind of inform. That's not groundbreaking. But what I'm seeing is where trustees are, certainly of the larger schemes, they seem to be absolute resolute in terms of let's not just think about generating good returns. Let's also think about the kind of world our members are going to retire into. And so they're thinking with this universal owner mindset. So that's kind of their starting point from what I'm seeing. And then they've set themselves kind of these decarbonization objectives. There's also other kind of, S&G objectives, to be more active owners. And so then you then have to then think about, well, alongside what you're doing with your investment strategy, how are you delivering into those other kind of objectives that you're trying to set out for yourselves? Like if you want to create real world change, then maybe you need to have some measures around what kind of climate solutions you're financing. If you want to create changes in some of the companies you're behaving, is there an effective way of measuring the impact of your stewardship activities? And so to me, it's all about having the right kind of measures, the KPIs, and thinking beyond some of the just the headline metrics. So the one thing I'd ask of the pension fund community, and I think has been excellent in this space, is just to get a bit more involved in some of the nitty-gritty of, coming up with some of these new metrics. And so this is me shamelessly with my PCAF hat, plugging it. We don't have any UK pension schemes, members of the UK chapter of PCAF. So, come and join, get involved, roll up your sleeve, help develop carbon accounting standards.
Thank you. I thought it was really, really helpful. And I think some of the things that's come up is how much things need to change, or systems and processes and governance across accounting, across decision making, across access to information, across what kind of advice we get, across the legal and kind of implementation advice. I'm sure we haven't touched on it, but the way that we research and due diligence things, etc., etc. So I was wondering if I could turn to you, Asa, and maybe talk about some of those nitty-gritty elements, I guess, in more detail, and how things have changed. What does addressing this across the board look like?
Yeah. Addressing this across the board requires a really wide suite of activities. It could be, policymaker lobbying, really good stakeholder communication and disclosure, long-term risk analysis. Now, I'm not an expert of those, so I won't talk about this. What I'll talk about, however, is what should investment committees do in their portfolio of assets. To me, to Impact Cube, it's about doing some combination of the next four things I'm going to tell you in an intentional and considerate way. The first one is lowering footprint of your portfolio. In some way, it could be different definitions, different scope combinations of carbon, water, waste. Lower footprint is important. The second one would be investing in transition climate solution. But again, like I said earlier, in an intentional and considerate way. There is not an investment strategy for all seasons, and trustees have to be flexible to be cognizant of that. And then the next two is to know when to divest and when to engage. That's really tricky. there are sectors, there are lost causes that pension plans should arguably divest from, or companies that have failed to respond to good engagement. And then there are, on the other hand, dirty companies that are well worth engaging. So it's about doing some combination of those four things: lowering footprint, aligning your revenue to the future, divesting and engaging in an intentional way.
Thank you. Leah, if I might ask you the same question.
Sure. I think Aston stole one or two of mine, but I will forgive him for that. No, I think that the way that we think about this at ISIO is that we have a broad suite of clients. So we work with pensions, but also family offices and endowments. So we need to be quite agile in the advice we give. So I think the first thing that we do is really look to understand the individual client priorities, so that we can set a sort of more bespoke journey of where they're trying to get to. You know, are they a high climate ambition client, or are they a slightly lower climate ambition client? And I think the advice you give at that point would be really different. So you set the priorities, build that through into the strategy and portfolio and the way that you monitor things. I think the only other thing might be a bit around some sort of myth busting and sort of having some deeper conversations, because I think one of the things that we encounter quite a lot is around impact versus returns, and I think a good manager can do both. And thinking about overcoming the systemic risk discussion. I think we talk about climate change so much as a risk that often investors can forget that it's also an opportunity, because of course it's a systemic risk, of course it's something we have to deal with. But I think when you flip it into that opportunity discussion, you've got a real opportunity to catalyse action. I think it's a much more optimistic conversation to have. I think the only other thoughts I might add is there could be a lot of ambition in there. You could have a client that wants to aim for a well below 2 degrees scenario. I'm not sure if we should talk about 1.5 anymore, but I'll sidestep that discussion. But what if that low carbon world doesn't eventuate? What happens then to your portfolio? And I think some of the leading asset owners or pension trustees that we work with are sort of straddling that dual track of aiming low and coping high. How is your portfolio resilience, and how will it cope if we don't meet that ambition that we've set as an industry? I think Mike wants to come in again, so I'll pause there.
I think we want to make sure we leave time for audience questions. I'll come to you, Mike, and then Mark, I noticed you nodding along as well, so I'll come to you for a closing thought, and then we will pass over to you guys, so please do get ready.
You've been very good exposing different viewpoints in this panel. Here's some more. I advise asset owners to forget about carbon footprints. They are not a financial risk metric. They're a very poor proxy for it. To Hetal, I would actually advise asset owners not to get involved with PCAF. They've got much better things to do with their time, like get involved with the IAS 37 and IAS 38 accounting problem, which will solve things because we have not yet slain the ghost of Enron past. The universal owner point is helpful, but let us not forget a universal owner does not have to be a universal owner. If they own 0.5% of everything, they can own 1% of half the universe and 0 of the other. So we need to be very careful with the universal owner thinking, because it can lead to poor thinking.
So, Mark, any closing thoughts?
I'll just put it in. Hello? Right. The context of the regulator, I look through a lens of portfolio resilience, effectively. So it's about helping trustees with improving their investment strategies, improving that portfolio resilience to the impacts of climate change, nature loss, biodiversity loss, and material social factors. So it's not about making them eco-warriors and saying you've got to save the planet. It's about those outcomes for savers.
Brilliant. That's an excellent point to end on. So really, over to you. Please raise your hand, and maybe there'll be a mic, I think, in the back there, and then maybe we can go to the gentleman in this middle row, and then right there in the row behind him. Can you hear me? Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much for the panel. I'm not a financial expert, but I'd like to ask, where does, in the fiduciary world and in investing, where does shame sit versus profit in terms of how we currently look at all of our reporting? And what would be your opinion about how, as trustees, you may look at reputational risk and shame versus your financial returns?
Can I just say an initial comment to that? Shame and reputation ultimately does have a financial value. It might not be transparent today, but over time, people will gravitate, towards, if they think this company is greener, has better ethical approaches, more aligned with society, then it will become apparent over time. And so I think that the two are not, separate.
Aston, then Mike.
May I go first, Mike? Okay. I'm currently engaging in lots of defense policy reviews with asset owners at the moment. So shame is a topic that is often on top of the agenda. So, not doing enough in climate or investing in certain arms company. My only offer to this conversation is trustees have to take a practical approach and strike the balance between risk, return, fiduciary financial duties, as well as what some stakeholders may term as shame. Because there is shame to be involved in companies that are active in Gaza, for sure. There's also shame in not meeting your fiduciary financial goals. So there are shames from all places, and it's a trustee's job to get the right balance given what's their mandate.
In true political style, I'm going to turn the question into something that Sophia was going to ask me about. The time for shame will be when trustees publish their transition plans. I'll say it in public, in front of this audience. If the Pensions Regulator ever says transition plans are a good thing and we're going to do something, I will take Mark out to dinner. The great thing about transition plans is they combine societal risk and financial risk, and they'll be mostly financial. If you want to frame, this is back to your systems point, the Paris Agreement was an attempt to understand the system. It failed. Article 21C assumes that 21A and 21B work. They don't. We built GFANZ, which is the CFO for the world. There is now a conversation about Article 21D, which is for a Chief Risk Officer of the world. Those translate down into national transition plans. National transition plans frame transition plans for any entity, pension fund, company, regulator. So the time for shame will be when pension fund trustees publish their transition plan and you all comment on them.
I look forward to it. I think there was another question just in the middle row here. This gentleman with his hand up.
Thanks. I've got a question about pensions, asset owners, and engagement with politics and financing of politics. So just throw a couple of things out there. Paul Marshall is the owner of GB News. He gets much of his profits from Marshall Wace hedge fund and uses those to fund climate delay communications and campaigns. Another sort of stat would be, if you look at the odds checker for the next general election and who's going to have the biggest number of seats, more odds in favour of a party that is not supportive of net zero. So clearly there's a risk that any net zero oriented investments are going to die or suffer from the current state of politics and its financing. What are pension asset owners allowed, or what are they doing to influence that regulatory environment?
I'll say a couple
May
of
Hettle, and then I can turn to the regulator.
This is not an easy question, and I'll try and stay out of the politics. I'll try and stay out of the politics side of this.
I won't.
That's why I'm going first. Clearly, there is a trend in the Western world for rightward parties that they're in the ascendancy, and some of the policies that they have, put out there, will make the climate situation worse. there's no question about it. And what is the impact of that? We're going to have more climate refugees. We're going to have more migration as a result. So unfortunately, all I see is a bit of a doom spiral at the moment. So it's a slightly gloomy picture, but I personally don't see it as the role of pension fund trustees and those who are in charge of pensions to try. It's not there. Ultimately, you could have advocacy groups, individual members. They can try and affect change, but that shouldn't be the role of trustees.
I guess you're not going to be surprised. 2 data points. A year ago, a very fine group of pension fund trustees set up the Trustees Sustainably Working Group, led by the indefatigable Bobby Ridaway, another fine actuary. They are a voice for pensions in policy. A lot of resources wasted on stewardship downwards. Stewardship to policy upwards just changes the rules for everybody. So the TSWG, which I'm pleased to be a member, is actually doing what I think trustees need to do, because unless we change the rules of the way certain economic activities are favoured and certain are not, we're not going to proceed. Another data point, I was with a Conservative MP yesterday. They're probably the hardest nut to crack beyond reform. And I have been asked to write a short paper for interested members of the Shadow Cabinet, because clearly Kemi Badenoch's 1% of emissions ignores the fact that financial markets are mispricing risk. There will be tipping points well before the subpolar jar or AMOC tips. Do not ask me climate science questions. Financial markets, remember Lehman, remember the GFC. All of a sudden, financial markets think, oh, I didn't price that risk before. So in fact, to your very excellent point, making climate change a financial risk and a threat to the savings of UK citizens is the way I'm going personally.
Over to you.
So it's the same approach from the regulator. It's about the financial impact and outcomes for savers, looking through that risk management, opportunity management lens, and portfolio resilience. In terms of engagement with us as a policymaker, we engage with the groups that Mike was just talking about, and others such as the Asset Owners Council, to talk about how we can improve disclosures, where the barriers are to better understanding of climate risks, nature risks. Also transition planning, which Mike has touched on as well. What is it that asset owners and trustees are looking for moving forward? What's going to make their lives easier in terms of managing those risks and opportunities in the interest of savers?
Great. Thank you so much. I think we had another question just here. This person at the end of that row. Sorry, seem to be sitting in a very awkward spot to get the microphone to you.
I think there's one at the back as well.
Oh, brilliant.
Hi, my name's Tegs. I am a pensions trustee. My question for you guys is, what do you think a resilient portfolio actually looks like? Because one that focuses on decarbonisation is doing nothing to protect members from systemic risk or de-risk the global economy.
Leila, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll have a go. I think it will ultimately depend on the ambition that is set, you know very well. But I think there are some things that could be thought about in terms of hedging risk. So if we look at, for example, decarbonisation risk, and as that starts to pull through into the portfolio, some of our sort of leading asset owners have maybe been looking at the role of carbon credits and carbon credit funds in sort of generating a sort of hedge against rising decarbonisation risks. There's also the resilience piece around physical adaptation. So I'd say that as an industry, we're really quite far behind on adaptation versus mitigation. But it is really important, and I think there's increasing traction around that conversation. And you are seeing leading asset owners investing in potentially some, flood-resilient infrastructure or areas where maybe, climate change impacts might come through quite strongly, and how are they thinking about the adaptation. Another thing is just talking to your managers. So are you happy with the way that your managers are addressing climate risks. And I think the leading managers that we work with have very advanced analytics on sort of thinking about that adaptation question and the types of sort of risks that might be coming through to particular types of portfolio assets or companies, you know, whether that's flooding risk or, you know, wildfire risk, whatever the risks are coming through. I guess ultimately what I'm saying is, you know, there are some hedging things we can do. So, you know, clever investments that are developing. But the other thing is data. Do we have enough data, and do we know what to do with it? Because I think we're talking a lot about data, but actually there's this data saturation point where there's loads of data, and is it really being leveraged for the right purposes? And I guess adaptation data is lagging, and if we can get enough adaptation data through, which some of these leading managers are starting to do, and build that into a way that they are constructing funds or managing funds, I think that is also another key area to look out for. But those are just a few examples from some of the specific asset owners that we've been working with. And obviously it's all to do with your specific ambition, which is, you know, if you've set a net zero target, have you thought about, you know, hedging that carbon risk? Or if you have started to think about adaptation, how have you started to think about it? Data, investment solutions, etc. But I think there are a million ways you could answer that question. But those are just a few of the examples we've seen.
Thanks, really, really helpful. I know Mike has
Well,
one last thought.
I need to highlight that TEGS is a very fine leading member of TSWG, so if you want to speak to Wise Pension Fund Trustee, speak to TEGS afterwards. The answer to your question is start with the transition plan. If you had a net zero target, ditch it. You do financial risk. So realise that modern portfolio theory doesn't work. Realise that the scenarios peddled by the investment consultant industry have resulted in pension funds publishing things like at 4 degrees we're going to lose 70 bips. At 4 degrees there's probably not a lot going on. So I think this whole rethinking in a transition plan before you get down to strategic asset allocation is where I'd start.
Really helpful, thank you, Mike. Every time the 4 degrees stat is brought up from loading the dice against pension funds, I sort of do a double take because it's just such an absurd.
Trustees have published it.
Yeah.
Trustees have published this. They clearly didn't have a climate scientist on the investment committee.
Maybe that's one of the things we need to start suggesting. Everybody should have a climate scientist on the investment committee.
Oh, we have that discussion in Canada. In Canada, we've had that discussion that we should have climate scientists on investment committees.
There we go. Maybe that's one practical piece of advice everybody can take away. I think we had one last question at the back. Maybe we can take them both very briefly and just one person from the panel asks, and that should take us to time.
No, thanks very much. So just thinking about pension trustee boards, and you know, we've approached them as a very homogeneous group. But if I think about pension trustee boards, I mean, the Institute of Actuaries have shared that of pension trustees in the UK, only 12% are female. And then another consultancy has shared that 25% of all trustee boards in the UK are all male. So I'm just wondering about how, I guess as an industry, we can promote that cognitive diversity, that diversity of thought amongst pension trustee boards to empower them to make decisions that are more aligned with sustainable considerations, sustainable investment goals and ambitions.
Thank you. That's a really excellent question. Does anybody particularly want to take that?
I'll let Mike go first this time.
We are very,
Speak to Charlotte O'Leary at Pensions for Purpose, who is on board with us on that issue.
Perfectly phrased.
I was just going to add with a research hat, there's definitely a lot of research out there that shows, you know, meritocracy and thinking about diversity of boards is good for returns, good for business. So a really good point, and one I would fully agree with.
I'll just add that there is a point around enforcing tenure on boards.
An excellent point.
We don't have, whereas we do in the corporate governance world. So yes, if you're 76 and been on the board for 6 years, you're off. If you're male.
Excellent. I think they had one last question at the front. I can actually just give you my...
Hi, thanks for this excellent discussion. I live in Singapore in Asia And really the discussion there is all about transition. And transition planning is already mandated in many countries already. We're already in disorderly transition. That's our house view as well. And you probably have seen this report that came out recently called the Climate Scorpion by the actuaries as well. Oh, was that you? Okay.
I was very close to it.
Okay, yeah. So that clearly gives a view that actually maybe we're not taking that the resilience perspective sufficiently, as pension funds and trustees have a role to play in that as well.
You know, the next report was called Planetary Solvency, which is now referred to as Planetary Insolvency, so do keep up.
Okay. All right. So just key question is, one of the biggest lever points would be the benchmarks that get set and the asset allocation that follows on the back of the benchmarks that get used as well. And obviously the pension trustees, and there are key lever points around what the trustees decide, such as the investment consultants, etc. So how can we make sure that the trustees are part of the conversation that takes all of this into account so that the decision making around the benchmarks can actually take into account the resilience around the climate transition?
Thank you. I think we're running very short on time, so who wants to take that question?
I can do that a little bit.
Perfect.
Just very quickly, there are two things that the most advanced investment boards are doing to take that into account. First one is to stop using a broad market cap weighted benchmark for the analysis. You don't have to, it's convenient to, but you can choose something that has sustainability already built in, have resilience already built in to do the analysis. Secondly, the most advanced players are using 3D analysis to do their strategic asset allocation. So not just risk and return, but they're making choices explicitly around risk, return, and sustainability. That kind of three-dimensional analysis helps trustees, helps the board to picture the trade-offs between those three dimensions.
Go on then.
At a meeting I was recently, we tackled exactly this point. The first point is that standard indices are terrible because they include mispriced financial risk. So passive management against a standard index is actually funding Exxon. That's probably not a good idea. When you say benchmark, you probably then think index. No. Your benchmark, I suggest, as a pension fund is to pay your pensions. From that flows your investment strategy. So sort of to the comments on the panel, you need to get strategic, systemic risk into your thinking before SAA and be much more relaxed about tracking error, because if you're tracking the wrong thing, tracking error is an error.
Thank you so much. I think we're almost at time, so I was going to ask one final question to you all. A word, two, maybe four max. It's 5 years from now. Things have changed positively. What looks different? Do you want to start?
Starting with me. I think we need to start small, digestible. So I think when we talk about climate impact, and sorry, you did ask me to be quick, and now I'm not being quick. When we think about climate impact, it's such a huge and enormous issue that I think we go very big blue sky thinking. It becomes a bit overwhelming. So I think once you've set an ambition, start small. What's the first thing that you can do in the next few months, and go there, and then just keep taking steps from there? Because I think bite-size approaches are successful. To not overwhelm, because this is just such a big systemic risk. I think trying to tackle the whole at once will be rather challenging.
Thank you. Aston?
I'm very optimistic based on our discussions with asset owners. I think in 4 or 5 years' time, they'll be much more educated on the risk and return impact of sustainability and be much more confident in putting that into their portfolio.
Adel?
We'll have better data.
Right.
Oh dear. Societal risk and financial risk are different. So far it's been advised, this is a plug. I'm on the advisory board of Visit, VYZRD. They bring the two together.
Brilliant. Mark?
Integrated transition plans will be the norm, and we'll have moved away from a rear view look at disclosures.
Yes, yes.
Hear, hear. Brilliant. Well, this has been a fascinating and wide-ranging discussion, and I feel like we haven't even covered a sort of fraction of the things we could have. We just touched on transition plans. We had a long discussion about risk, around time horizons, about roles and responsibilities and accountabilities. So I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists. It has been a real pleasure and a lot of fun, controversies and all. And mostly a huge thank you to all of you for coming and listening and putting up with my struggles with the microphone, because that was very stressful. Have an excellent rest of London Climate Action Week and rest of Reset Connect. And thank you all so much.